Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to NCBI's Advocacy Talks. My name is Liz Jeffrey, and I'm NCBI's Advocacy Officer. Before I introduce our guest presenters this month, let me remind you that this session is recorded and can be accessed on NCBI's YouTube channel through our website. You can also post questions into the chat session, and we will ask those questions of our presenters at the end of their presentation today. So today we are absolutely delighted and thrilled to have Lindsay Coyle and Lewis Winton from the Royal National Institute for People Who Are Blind. They're coming today specifically to talk to us about campaigning at a regional level with volunteers and supporters. And we know that this will be of particular interest to all the members of NCBI's local advocacy network groups around the country who are learning all about advocating and campaigning. So welcome, Lindsay and Lewis. We are absolutely delighted to have you, and tell us what you're doing at RNIB.
So we'll just do some quick introductions first. I was Lindsay Coyle, so I look after our team of regional campaigns officers. Lewis, would you just say kind of your role as well?
Yeah, certainly. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lewis Winton, and I'm the Regional Campaign Officer for RNIB in the wonderful northeast of England.
So what we thought we'd do to start off with is just talk a little bit about kind of the structure of the team. We're going to try and do it as a double-hander, so you won't hear one of us talking for a huge amount of time. So try and make it as interesting as and interactive as possible. So basically we have 9 Lewises essentially across the 9 English regions.
Aren't you lovely?
So we have got 9 regional campaigns officers for each, because it corresponds to each of the 9 English regions. Our colleagues in the devolved nations have their own campaigns teams. This goes slightly separate, but we do when we can try and do things jointly, where we can sort of have policies and messaging that would align. So our team is also supported by our central policy team. So our policy colleagues essentially are, I guess, the wealth of knowledge around kind of what RNIB's view on different issues. So if at local level we might get asked, oh, what does RNIB think about, I don't know, electronic scooters, or what do we think about zebra crossings, then our central team, our policy expertise have that kind of knowledge to say, this is what we should say about zebras, or we might prefer different kinds of crossings. So they're very much kind of the what we think kind of messaging. We also have a public affairs team that work obviously with kind of MPs in Westminster. So we're supported by a kind of a central policy and campaigns function. We also have colleagues who look after comms, so things like our social media presence, kind of how we engage on kind of social media or newsletter to sort of get the message out to a much wider audience. In terms of the regional campaigns officer role specifically, and this is a bit that we'll probably spend a bit more time talking about today. So I described the role, and I did the role before coming in to manage the team. So I describe it as having sort of 3 strands. So part of it is around taking whatever campaign we're working on nationally and rolling it out at local level. So we're doing work around, we're about to launch a campaign around accessible health information. So part of what my team would do is take our national campaign and see whether we can get local people involved in it in some way, or if you want people to, I don't know, write to their MPs en masse because there's some bill going through Parliament, our regional campaigns team are on the ground and can try and encourage people to take those actions. The other 2 parts of it are much more the local focused work. So the second bit of it is around picking up on local issues that people might raise with the regional campaigns officers, and they could be a myriad of things. And we find that often, and Lewis might elaborate a bit more, but sort of streets and travel and transport and getting about is one of the biggest issues that we get raised with us at local level. Or it might be there's a threat to a specific service. For example, we might know there's a very long waiting list for vision rehab, for example, in a specific local authority. Or it might be, I don't know, there's issues with education support for children in a specific area. So it might be that we are aware of a specific threat to a service, or we might get involved in local council consultations on things. If they're saying, oh, we're going to build a new bus station here, or we're going to reshape services on, I don't know, on adult social care, for example, we might respond to consultations that way. So our regional campaigns team will pick up on issues that are very much local to the regions that they cover. The second strand of it, and the third bit of it, is really around the support to our campaigners and volunteers. So each regional campaigns officer works with somewhere between 4 and 6 volunteer campaigners, and would also try and engage with kind of other people who might not want to be a volunteer, who often don't want to sign up as a volunteer, but might still want to get involved and attend an event or sign a petition or do something, a kind of a lower level activity. So I'm going to hand across to Lewis to talk a bit more about our volunteers and what they get up to at local level. So I'll stop now. Lewis, you want to take over?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much, Linz. And that really does segue nicely into my section. Lindsay gave a really good overview of how RNIB is structured on a national and a local level. But one of the integral components to that structure is our volunteers. And I view our volunteers to be the bedrock, the heartbeat of our organisation and what we do here at RNIB. Now, on a local level, as Lindsay mentioned, each regional campaigns officer will line manage between 4 to 6 volunteer campaigners. Now, in some instances, it can be a lot more than that. So here in the North East, I'm just thinking last year, especially pre-pandemic, I think we had around 10 volunteer campaigners in the North East. And those volunteer campaigners will work on a vast array of different issues. But to give an insight to what kind of issues they could work on, one of our big campaign successes quite recently in the North East. Now, I'm sure everybody listening this afternoon will be well aware of tactile paving and how integral tactile paving is for blind and partially sighted people. Now, we had a number of our volunteers and service users come to us in 2019 and raise concerns over the Tyne and Wear Metro service. Now, to give context, the Tyne and Wear Metro service is a metro service across Tyne and Wear, which spans 77 kilometres, which has a total of 60 different stations. So covering the cities such as Sunderland, Newcastle and the surrounding areas. Now, they brought these issues and concerns to us, and what they said was, look, the Tyne and Wear Metro service essentially doesn't have tactile paving on every single platform throughout its network. So, working alongside myself, our network of volunteers, we went out, we done a mapping exercise, and then we opened dialogue with the Tyne and Wear Metro service, which is operated by Nexus. So from doing all that research, doing that legwork, we found out that of the 60 different stations, there was actually 15 different stations that didn't have tactile paving on their platform edges. Essentially, so we knew due to that reason, blind and partially sighted people were essentially putting themselves at risk each and every time they access that service. Now, you may or may not be aware, but unfortunately, in recent times, there's been a number of fatalities, and unfortunately, there's a guy called Cleveland Jarvis who, unfortunately, his guide dog and himself ended up on the train tracks, and it actually resulted in a fatality in London. Now, RNIB have launched a national campaign on this, but here in the North East, we really got to work on drilling down and exerting pressure on Nexus to install tactile paving on every single platform edge. We outlined guidance such as the National Guidance on Tactile Paving set by the Department for Transport, the Equality Act 2010. We really did collaborate with all of our local stakeholders, our local societies. We've got our local MPs involved. And I'm delighted to confirm that Nexus made a commitment to have all stations installed with tactile paving within 2 years. Now, I'm absolutely delighted to confirm, as of I think it was June last year, Nexus are the only rail network in the United Kingdom to have tactile paving installed on every single platform throughout their network, which is an incredible result for blind and partially sighted people. Now, that wouldn't have been possible without our volunteers here at RNIB. They really are the bedrock, the heartbeat of what we do at RNIB. And as Lindsay mentioned, it's all about uniting as a community, coming together, working together to collaborate to make sure that we can make the built environment more safe, more inclusive for blind and partially sighted people. With regards to our offer at RNIB for our volunteers, we offer them comprehensive training packages. So we appreciate that volunteers are at a different point in their journey. And one thing that we do always make clear at RNIB is volunteering is very much a two-way street, but it's not what they can give to the organisation, but it's what we can give back to them, whether that be CV building, whether that be gathering experience, whether that be developing skill sets. It very much is a two-way journey. We have lots of different policy position statements which we can brief our campaign volunteers with. We have commissioned research and reports. So every time our volunteers will be going out in the community to meet with our ward councillors, to meet with MPs, to meet with external partners, to be fully briefed by RNIB and line managed by their regional campaign officer. What we do have at RNIB as well is our monthly campaigns discussion group, which is a virtual platform for all of our campaigners and all of our supporters to come together across the United Kingdom to basically have that one-stop shop where we can discuss all campaigns, we can bounce ideas off each other, we can learn from each other, but ultimately it's making sure that our volunteers keep connected with each other. Linz, I'll hand back across to you.
Sorry, I started talking and I realised I was still on mute, which isn't really helpful. Like, how many we've done times we've done that. So we've talked a bit about our volunteer campaigners and the role that our regional campaigns officers manage. Aside from that, we have a kind of a monthly generic e-newsletter that goes out from RNIB that covers lots of issues as well as campaigning, and we find that's a huge gap. So either you're a volunteer or you're on our email mailing list, and what we think there's a gap kind of in between, where we have a lot of people who, for whatever reason, because they don't have the time, have other commitments, don't want to be a volunteer necessarily. And certainly for us as a relatively big organisation, if you sign up as a volunteer, it opens the door to doing sort of mandatory training, and it can be seen as a bit more of a commitment. We're trying to address that in some way. We're going to bring in a new role, which we're going to call a campaigns community supporter. So they won't be a volunteer as such, but they will be on our mailing list. And the plan and long term is to try up regional mailing lists. So if Lewis or anybody else in the team hears, oh, there's a consultation happening in Manchester, let's write to people that we know who live in Manchester. Or if there's an event that we're looking to host, or if there's an issue where we want to campaign to protect a local service, we could be much more agile and actually bring in people that are from that area. So the campaigns community support role is meant to be sort of quite light touch. So it might involve things like writing to their MP, or go to their MP in person, or attending the odd event, or sending a petition, or we might say we might hold a Teams focus group around if we're developing an area of policy, for example. So we might say, well, can you share your lived experience of, I don't know, going to vote at your local elections, for example. So it's quite a light touch role. But as I said, the idea long term is that we can send out some of our national campaign asks to this cohort of people, but equally locally, Lewis and the rest of his team will actually be able to build those relationships. So long term, some supporters might in time become volunteers if they want to, but there's no kind of expectation of that. We often find that campaigning isn't something that people kind of come into straight away. We often find that you almost need to be sort of nurtured and have their confidence built. It can be, if you haven't done it before, quite scary going to see your MPs. Like, oh, what do I say? What do I say to my MP? So it can be quite frightening for people. So we often find they often start slowly. They might come to an event, or they might say, oh yeah, I'll sign a petition on that issue, or I'll write to my MP about something. And in sort of months, then they might gain skills and confidence to actually become a volunteer and take more of a kind of a leading role. So just having this sort of mid-range role as a kind of a way of helping us kind of develop people as well. And so our CEOs can now bring people in without the need to sign up as a volunteer. They'll just literally sign up to effectively a mailing list, which we hope will make things a little bit easier. So that's that kind of role. And then Lewis, you want to just quickly talk a bit about the community connection team and how we kind of engage supporters, I guess, more widely than that even.
Absolutely, yeah. So we know with any campaign, it's integral that we gather as much support as we possibly can. And it's ultimately about unifying the community, whether that be working with national partners, whether that be working with local societies, local stakeholder groups. And RNIB has a wonderful team called Community Connection. And very much the clue is in the title. So that team, it aims to connect the community. And every time that we get a campaign, or every time we get a common trend or concerns are raised, the regional campaign officer will work with his counterparts in that team, and we'll work to promote that campaign. So we've got different platforms such as Facebook and different social media channels. The regional campaign officer might often go out to speak to local peer support groups, whether that be RNIB peer support groups, or whether that be kind of Macular Society or the Glaucoma Society, different peer support groups throughout the regions, to make sure that blind and partially sighted people in that respective region are kept abreast of issues. They're kept up to speed with what's going on. There can be an integral part behind that campaign, and ultimately you can never replace kind of that lived experience. And one thing that I always say as a regional campaign officer is I often go and have meetings with, you know, MPs and councillors and local authorities in Newcastle, Sunderland, Stockton, Middlesbrough. And when I go along to these places, I always go along with volunteers, with constituents of that constituency, because ultimately, you know, whether it be a local council, whether it be an MP or a ward councillor, they don't want to hear from me. They want to hear from their constituents. You know, they want to hear from their constituents. What is the issue? You know, what is the resolution? How can we overcome this barrier? How can we make our towns and our cities more inclusive, more accessible for blind and partially sighted people? Again, using the platforms for call to actions. So if it's a kind of a bigger campaign on a national level, our community connection team will really mobilize that community to, you know, to kind of sign stuff like e-signatures, our newsletters, making sure that the wider Connect community are really getting behind the campaigns, both on a national and a local level. Now, we know that there's an estimated 2 million people living in the United Kingdom with sight loss. Obviously, we've got one campaign officer per region. In my region alone, there's an estimated 90,000 people living with sight loss. So as you can imagine, working with 12 different local authorities, an estimated 90,000 people living with sight loss, it would be really difficult and really challenging for me to be in different places at once, to try and mobilise the troops on the ground. So working with our community connection colleagues, it's a real asset to make sure that we can get as many blind and partially sighted people, stakeholders, sector partners behind each campaign, to make sure we have as much impact as we possibly can.
Great, thanks for that, Lewis. And just to kind of, I guess, wrap things up from our side of things, the regional campaigns team, as it is, has been in existence since probably about 2008, and kind of varying internal changes. We haven't really reviewed where we're at with volunteers for quite a long time. So probably about a year ago, last summer, we decided to sort of review our volunteer campaign offer and how we supported volunteers. And we've tried to take volunteers with us on that whole journey. So their feedback really identified a number of different areas, anything from looking at the roles that we have to how we recruit people, what support we give people at induction. So when they come in, how we, you know, what training and support we offer them, as well as what we offer on a much more kind of long-term basis in terms of training sessions. And we also included things like comms, so how they received information from us and vice versa, how they linked in with their regional campaigns officers and volunteer manager. So we've really tried to be quite holistic and look at every aspect of this. So things that have come out of that really are kind of, I guess, around training in particular, the kind of the need to for training on things like working with local councils and how to run an effective campaign, essentially. So what we'd like to end up with is a programme of courses that we can offer on a rolling basis, and we're trying to investigate things like doing more things like Facebook Live. So we've just launched a campaign around accessible health information. So one of the things that we're looking at is actually using the regional Facebook groups that Lewis mentioned and sort of just doing like live webinars, like so we can have a Q&A, and because often what we find is issues can be quite complex. So when we did the campaign around access to voting, it can be quite a complex issue to sort of break down what the Elections Act says and what we'd like people to say to their MP. So we're looking more at how we can engage our supporters much more widely, but using different tools like sort of Facebook Live and so on. So, but certainly volunteers have had a hand in every aspect of that. So they've kind of co-written our role profiles. You know, they've looked at some of our kind of comms frameworks and input into that. So it's not us saying, here's what we're going to do and sort of presenting it as a done deal. We've tried to bring volunteers with us on that journey to just make sure that whatever we do is meeting people's needs, essentially, because we see, obviously, it's very much a kind of a two-way process that they need to gain from working alongside us as well. And if we can help people who want to find work or whatever, or want to gain certain skills or work on certain issues, then we try and do that as much as we can. So that is pretty much it from us in terms of how we work at regional level. I guess there's no kind of golden bullet to it, but I think advice that I probably would give, having worked in this role specifically, or the team, for probably about the best part of 14 years, is just being flexible. And if you've got more than one way of people to get involved, and actually building the role around people who want to get involved in support campaigns is great, and just getting your message out there as much as possible. But we are more than happy to share any of our template resources if it would be of any use, and happy to take any questions if there are any. I don't know that it's our chat that's pinging or something else that's pinging, but
no, it's the
yeah.
chat. If I could just quickly add to what you mentioned as well, Linz, with regards to volunteering, I think as an organisation it's integral to continue to evolve as well. And I think we very much know that since the pandemic, the landscape has very much changed, and we've had lots of conversation with our national partners about kind of volunteer recruitment, and it's not, well, it certainly hasn't been as easy as it was pre-pandemic, and there's hesitation on behalf of the volunteer to get involved, and we are starting to see a kind of an improvement on that front now. But yeah, it's about kind of evolving as an organisation, utilising kind of the digital world that a lot of people are living in now, to make sure that we can continue to move forward and make sure that volunteering and volunteers are kind of at the heartbeat of everything we do at RNIB.
I'm just looking at some of the questions, so if you're okay, Liz, just trying to sort of pick them off.
Absolutely, Lindsay. Yeah, go. If you can read that, would you like? I usually read them out and then so while you get your head around it. So
if you want to do it that way, that's absolutely fine. I've got them on my screen as well, so whatever's easy for you.
Okay, because there's probably some more coming in down the bottom. How many volunteers do you have in total, and what age are they generally? Whether there's a wide spread of ages.
Yeah, I would say in terms of the volunteer campaigners, which if you're familiar with kind of the ladder of engagement kind of concept, would be level 4. So the most engaged people, I'd say probably about 50 tops, and that's nationally. My gut is saying less is more. And I think Lewis has kind of alluded to that. I think as a regional campaigns officer, again, like Lewis, at one point I managed 10 volunteers. It's probably too many. So I think if you've got about between 4 and 6 per region who are very engaged and can actually in time lead work themselves, and you actually invest quite a lot of time in them. So I think less is more. Age is a really interesting question. I think most are probably working age, by and large, not exclusively, but certainly historically the pattern has been working age.
Yeah.
And would they be families, or a bit older when they're not as busy with families, or
a bit of both? I think.
I mean, I've always thought it to be very much a mixed bag. It's a great question, really good question, and I'm just thinking of the kind of the roster of volunteers that I've got now, and it very much is a mixed bag. I think I've got a few volunteers that are kind of retired. I've got a few volunteers of a working age. Good mix from male to female. So yeah, it really is a mixed bag. And the bolt onto that question as well regarding what percentage of volunteers are blind or partially sighted, and I would say about 95%, Linz, if not higher.
Historically, actually, we before the current review, we actually ring fenced the role, so people had to have sight loss. However, having just reviewed the role, we thought that probably wasn't the best approach to take, purely because we had people who were either like a spouse of somebody with sight loss, or we had somebody I think, like, we've had head teachers, we've had doctors occasionally come in weirdly and request to become a volunteer or get more involved. So what we did want to do is then exclude people. The caveat is actually we then don't want is sighted people to sort of speak on behalf of people who have sight loss. It's very much a role that is managed, but we haven't put on any more of that caveat. The person themselves has to have sight loss, as long as they have an understanding and appreciation of, and ideally some experience, some first hand. So whether it's a close family member with sight loss, for example, or a friend. I think we've had somebody come on, I think her best friend has sight loss. So it's about just capitalising on that talent.
That's very interesting, Lindsay, because at the moment our local advocacy networks we've started, like you have, where the membership is solely for people who are blind or vision impaired. Because of some of the reasons you've mentioned, we don't want to have a dominance of people who aren't sighted, aren't vision impaired or blind, you know, becoming the speakers on behalf of. But you have a good point, you know, but if you have that caveat, I suppose that the person, the reasons they're there for is because they've had the experience, the third-hand experience of a friend, family member, or someone else. Maybe, you know, it might be the way that for our groups to develop. Our groups are only a couple of years old, so very early in development there. So thank you for that. That's a good insight for us to have. Thank you. What else is there?
Trialled across actually as a buddy role. So occasionally what people have said, volunteers have said, is actually what the problem is just getting to places. So we've occasionally had people, a volunteer driver, for example, as a buddy. I think we've classed it as a buddy role. And just to put it back, as I'm jumping around a bit, for the question on age, we're going to trial in Leeds to have a young person's campaign group. I say young, I'm sort of talking 18 to 30-ish. And I think for that audience, we're going to have to sort of be quite tailored in our offer, but that is something that we're looking to target young adults.
Yes, the energy of young people, getting young people coming in, absolutely. Question there, how many volunteers, how do you identify local and national campaigns? How do you decide, I presume that person means, how do you decide what should stay local, what should go national, and where does it all come from?
Lewis, you want to pick up on the local question?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and again, I get this question a lot when I go out and do talks for different groups, and the beauty of RNIB is having the different regions and the different structures for the regional campaign officers. On a local level, we essentially have, I suppose, a degree of autonomy to go out there, to listen to the people in our regions, to find out what the issues are. If there's common trends that arise, then we look to kind of mount a campaign behind that. Again, it does differ from region to region in terms of what the local issues are, but naturally you do get different examples that kind of shine through to be an issue and prevalent right across the United Kingdom. So e-scooters is an example where, yes, we know it's an issue in Newcastle, we know it's an issue in Sunderland, but we also know it's prevalent across many cities across England as well. So you can see how local campaigns then become national campaigns, but you can also see how issues kind of associated to what I mentioned on the Tyne and Wear Metro service. So the Tyne and Wear Metro service is only in the northeast, so that issue stays locally, despite other rail operators having similar issues, or whether it be kind of a controlled crossing issue that we're working on in County Durham. So you've got that clear distinction between local issues and national issues.
Yeah, and I think added to that, certainly nationally, that our national campaigns are decided by our central team, depending on what issues are being raised, what's happening at parliamentary level. So so we have a bit, I guess, a bit less autonomy of what those specific topics are. But as Lewis said, certainly at the regional level, the guys do. So I guess the thing to add to that as well is that if somebody comes to us with an issue that we are not campaigning on nationally, and may or may not be something that would pick up locally, what we try and do is give people the tools to address things themselves. So we have things, for example, if somebody is the guide dogs refused access, for example, somewhere, we have a toolkit with things like template letter in there, guidance on what the Equality Act says, so we can actually encourage people to go off and advocate for themselves. And that's kind of really what we want, is actually not just always it being RNIB saying certain things, because an MP will go, it's your RNIB, you would say that. But actually, if you're going to your local councillor as a constituent or a resident, or going to see your MP at surgery, it is far more powerful. And we can come in with backup in terms of having our policy or asks for an MP. So it's very much a two-way thing, but I think the voice of local people is the most important tool that we have, essentially.
Absolutely agree with you. And I heard Lou saying earlier about bringing somebody who's blind or partially sighted with you to the consultations. I think hearing people with a lived experience is certainly more powerful than hearing from organisations or staff from organisations or whatever. On the volunteer role, there's a question there: is the volunteer role full-time?
Lewis, you want to pick that one up because you've got a better sense of how much you volunteer time-wise.
So again, another thing part on RNIB, what I do really love about the role is that essentially when it comes to volunteering at RNIB, we always take the person-centered approach. So if I got Mr. Bloggs who'd sent in a kind of a volunteer request, I'd make contact with Mr. Bloggs, meet him at a location which is convenient for him, and we'll have we sit down, we'll have a coffee, we'll chat about the role, we'll see what that person would like to achieve from being a volunteer. We'd assess kind of how much time you could devote to the role. So there's essentially, it's not a full-time role. I know we're just in the kind of the process now of allocating a select time that we would require each volunteer to devote to the role, but we are really flexible on that front as well. But generally speaking, you do get some volunteers that are really, have a lot more time to devote to that. But then you do get kind of your more generic campaign supporters who, again, they might be working full time. They might have busy, time commitments. So they'll devote kind of less time, but they're as equally important.
Thank you. As you mentioned earlier, or Lindsay might have mentioned something about position descriptions. Is that role descriptions for different types of volunteering, or could you explore that a little bit more?
The position statements are really what we do have role profiles of volunteers, but our policy position statements are essentially of view or opinion on something. We have a lot of these for different things on streets, for example, so things like, I don't know, crossings that are more accessible, so kind of zebra versus a puffin or a pelican, for example, or position on sort of segregation of pedestrians and cyclists. So really it's meant to sort of help us standardise our messaging. So obviously I've got 9 members of my team working with councils across the country, and what we want to make sure is that we're all saying the same thing. So our position statements make that very clear, so my team can sort of share with a local authority or an e-scooter operator our guidance or our position statement on a given issue, and that means our messaging is much more consistent. We're not saying one thing in one region and one thing somewhere else. The other thing for us, I don't know whether that applies to you in the same way, but some organisations that we work with operate across regions. So things like train operators are a good example, where they operate, say, across the north of England. So they might span more than one region. So again, that's really important to keep our messaging absolutely tight. That way, we're not deviating at all in terms of what we're saying.
I think it's worth mentioning as well that so our policy position statements, our campaign reports, our template letters can all be found on RNIB website. So lots of useful resources are out there on the website. So if anybody would like to take a look, then please feel free to do so.
We're slightly hidden. They've had a website restructure, and I think campaigning is not one to get involved. So there's a links at the top of the page, and I think we're under get involved. So I think we're in there now. So that's so great. Do come on out. But there's lots of things online that you can.
Thank you. That's fantastic.
Essentially all of the big issues out there, whether it be e-scooters, whether it be cycling or advertising boards, all of those issues that impact blind and partially sighted people, RNIB have a policy position statement on there as well, which is really in depth and really useful to kind of share with external partners, local councils, MPs. So please make use of that as well.
Thank you. And just Lewis, you're mentioning there, when someone comes along who wants to volunteer, you basically do an individual assessment with them to find out what the time they want to allocate or whatever. Do you also have a range of roles they can play, or is it just volunteer?
No, we do, absolutely. Within the campaign team itself, we have kind of two main roles. We have what we call the volunteer campaigner, which was formerly known as the volunteer campaign coordinator, which is more of a high level role, which would require kind of that volunteer to maybe go and have a meeting with an MP or to go and have a meeting with a ward councillor. But then we have more of the generic role, the campaign supporter role. And again, it is a journey, it's a pathway where we can work with that volunteer to develop them, give them the skill set they need, give them the training they need. So then over time, they can kind of develop to that more high level role as well. But broadly speaking, across the organisation, we have lots and lots of different volunteer roles. Again, all information can be found on RNIB's website, but there's a wide range of volunteer roles available out there.
And the reason I asked you that is one of those questions is, do I need any particular skills to be a volunteer?
I'd say no. Sense of humour is always really good.
Yeah,
that's a skill. What I'd say add to that, what we learned historically, and kind of when I was an RTO, we had formal roles. We had a volunteer campaign lead that was for me who would go and lead a campaign. We had a campaign assistant role that was essentially an office-based role, as well as the volunteer campaign coordinator, which was the main role. And what we found is that having more roles complicated things.
Okay.
So we've brought it all into, to be a volunteer, you are in this volunteer campaigner role. If you want to do a more light touch role, you are in this campaigns community supporter role. So we kind of really want to simplify it rather than get involved in it. Ended up feeling a bit like trying to put, what's the word, square pegs in round holes.
Yeah.
So the volunteer campaigner role can really be built around the person's interests, their skills. We often find people come because they've got an issue that's a specific interest for them, and we just build it on that. But yeah, I think that's a bit of learning that I would take away, that actually simplifying the structure made a lot of sense.
That's great to hear that you not only build it around the reason that the person's come to you because they have a particular interest in some issue, but also around, the skills they bring, their life skills that they bring along. Because the best kind of volunteering is volunteering with something that you feel that you're using the skills and learning a bit for others. I'm interested to hear that we are also on the same scale as you, people that don't actually want to actively get involved.
Yeah.
So, but we have what we call a national advocacy newsletter, the NAN, and people join up for that and they get all the details. And we often find people sometimes come from there and they decide to get involved actively in our advocacy networks after a while when they've been, receiving all the information all the time. And some people just stay on that, and that's fine too.
I think in answer to that question around the specific skills, I think one of the things that we'd like to make sure happens in a more robust way is when somebody's new, particularly, that we offer them some basic levels of training. So things like working with a local council, so they understand the structures, how decisions are made locally, and give them that information, how to run a campaign. So there's some off-the-shelf, essentially, courses that we can just pretty much run with. So that gives a very, very basic level, but I don't think people need to come in as an experienced campaigner or know the ins and outs of how Parliament works. I think a lot of that we can address as they go. What I would say, the only skill I would probably say to that, and I don't know what you think on this, Lewis, is actually what we have found historically is actually if somebody has lived experience is when they might need to separate that out. So if they are going in to see an MP or a councillor as themselves and sharing the lived experience is great, but there might be a case where they occasionally are representing RNIB, and that's where we have to be quite careful of actually if we're representing us, you have to stick to this RP points and messaging. Fine to bring in your own experiences to back that up, but we have to make that distinction quite clear between when you're representing yourself and when you're representing the wider cohort of blind partial sighted people. And actually, it's not just about your own lived experience; it's about other people's. Everybody's experience is different. That's the only thing I would say, is being able to sort of see that bigger picture is quite useful sometimes.
And just to add to that as well, I mean, I've been at RNIB now for around 6 years, and there's been a number of occasions where we've had volunteers that have applied for a role, and when we sit down and do that initial volunteer interview and have a chat and kind of build up that working relationship, it can turn out that the role that they may have applied for might not be the correct role at that time, but it's about detailing that to that volunteer and offering them an alternate as well. And it might well be we can set out that development plan. So in 6 to 12 months time, that volunteer will be ready for that position. But in that interim period, making sure that they've got that comprehensive support to get to that point as well. But right throughout that journey, making sure they've got, you know, good communication with RNIB, with a designated volunteer manager, but making sure that they feel comfortable throughout that whole journey.
Just to add, my little girl's come home from school, so I might have a child in the background. So just, I'm sure we'll have an opinion on this. I can't see any more questions on the chat.
There's one more question. Is motivating volunteers an issue?
Yeah. Do you want to answer that one, Lewis? You probably
absolutely.
The final one come in there.
Yeah, I suppose great question. And I suppose we're human beings ultimately, aren't we? We're all different as characters. We're all different as people. We've all got different personalities. We do get some volunteers that are super motivated, super passionate, super driven, and we do naturally get some volunteers that are not as passionate, not as driven. Broadly speaking, I haven't found it particularly challenging to motivate volunteers, because it's often the case that if they want to become a volunteer, it's natural, especially if they want to become a campaigns volunteer, it's often the case that there's issues that impact them personally, and due to that reason they have a lot of motivation, a lot of passion, and they just need to channel that energy in the right direction to make sure they can make great change. But yeah, great question, but broadly speaking, I don't find it personally an issue to motivate volunteers.
The one challenge we have found though was doing things face to face. I think on the back of COVID,
yes, yeah,
that's been a bit, we tried to get volunteers together nationally, and that was quite a challenge, but not just due lack of motivation. I think it was people, we have some volunteers who are in work or other commitments, but we think feels to be a bit of a trend in terms of people losing their confidence traveling a bit as well. It's been a bit of an issue, so it's not so much motivation as such, it's more the barriers that we haven't quite overcome since coming out of COVID, I don't think. So certainly travel and doing things face to face, virtual is very much kind of taken over a little bit. So that's probably one challenge I would say we have had. I guess that leads on to the next question I've just spotted on the chat as well.
And the big one there, I guess that you've covered. Thank you so much for covering all those personal aspects that people bring to volunteering, and yes, certainly COVID brought some pros and cons with it. One of the cons was the loss of contact, face-to-face contact, but for a lot of people it allowed them to get involved. They weren't expected to travel on transport that wasn't available to them. It was very difficult to travel, so we're trying to look at a hybrid now of having a bit of both as we move out of COVID, rather than just all online. The final question, when we come back to the big campaigning issue, what do you think are the biggest challenges in campaigning for people who are blind, on issues for people who are blind or partially sighted?
Oh, that's a killer of a question, isn't it?
Yeah, really thought-provoking question, really good question.
Biggest challenges, they're the getting people face to face, I would say definitely. That's
I think one that I would say on a local level, Linz, and to everybody listening, is we work here in the Northeast with all local authorities, and sometimes, being visually impaired myself, we want things to move at a faster pace than they do. So, for example, I was working on a signal control crossing in County Durham, working with the local primary school, working with the local partnerships group and local residents, and that crossing itself took between 12 and 16 months in total to get a commitment from the council. Now, once you've got that commitment from the council to say the funding is ring fenced, you think, brilliant, job well done. However, then there's kind of the bureaucracy that you've got to go through, the internal protocol, getting it passed off by the Highways Committee. So yeah, I suppose to get a puffing crossing installed in total, from that first kind of contact with the local authority to actually, getting the crossing installed and operational, can be about 2.5 years. So that's, for me, one of the frustrations, how things can take so much time.
Absolutely, and thank you for letting our advocates know all about that, because sometimes doors open quickly, and sometimes it's persistence and perseverance that wins the day. But I guess the question that we we speak to our advocates about is that along that process, it's a good idea to keep asking yourself, is this still worth it? Is this what we're trying to achieve still worth it? Because sometimes issues do fall off. They're not as important as they used to be. But if they are, well, then you have to keep going through the process that you're talking about there.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the timing of things, as Lewis has said, I think it's just keeping that motivation over a long period of time can be a bit of a challenge, I think.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
I think ultimately as well, when you put it in its kind of finest contrast, what might be a big issue for us as blind and partially sighted people might not be a big issue for the local council, or might be I suppose they might have, you know, lots of different local lobbying groups or activists coming to them raising concerns with different aspects of the society itself. So it's getting that fine balance, but making sure that the voice of blind and partially sighted people is being heard loud and clear as well, and how you do that can be really challenging.
And it also opens itself up to being to explore different options along the way of trying new things. And the great thing about campaigning and advocacy is there's no hard and fast rule about how it's done. And you've explored that really well today, and everything that you've said, that, you know, the negotiation and flexibility around the volunteers themselves and how they go about their volunteering, the training that you're offering, which we also do. I think not the expectations of acknowledging everybody's contribution, but not everybody will have different sets of skills and things they want to learn at different paces, their own pace. So I think there's a lot of things that we're doing are very, very similar, but obviously you're doing them on a bigger scale. And it'll be great for the people listening today to hear that an organisation like yours is out there taking actions on all of these issues that are barriers to people who are blind or partially sighted participating in society. Yeah. Thank you very much. Is there anything you'd like to finally say to us as a part about you know the whole aspect of what underpins the reasons why we're campaigning on behalf of people who are vision impaired?
For me, it's about we can't campaign without volunteers and supporters. Yeah. I think it adds that legitimacy and credibility that we don't have on our own as an organisation. And it's, as I've said before, it's the most powerful tool that we've got is the individual voice. That if we come together collectively, just makes that voice much louder. So that's probably, and persevere, stick with it. Is probably what I'd say as well. And it can have its challenges, but I think it's the end result's worth the ends are worth the means, if that makes sense.
Definitely. And just to finish on that as well, I would completely echo what Lindsay said, but my mantra is teamwork makes the dream work. So keep banging the drum, guys.
Okay, lovely. Look, thank you both for coming along today. Just to remind everybody that the recording of this session will be up on NCBI's YouTube website. You can access through our website, and you're more than welcome to share this as widely as you want to. We will be putting it up on all our social media channels as well. Brilliant. And Lindsay and Lewis, thank you so much for your time today. It's been absolutely invaluable. I've learned even more myself. There's always more to learn about campaigning and volunteering. So thank you both. Much appreciated.
Well, any other questions you've got, feel free to come back to us directly as well. It's not a problem.
Wonderful. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Bye, guys. Take care.
Thanks. Bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.